Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The next session will begin in 2 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The next session is about to begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Danube stage, Eleanor Wragg.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this panel on restoring Ukraine for freedom and prosperity, the new Marshall Plan. Now, the Ukrainian resistance to Russian aggression and the bravery of its people have inspired the West and mobilized it to unified action. On top of unprecedented sanctions, Western leaders have vowed to launch a new Marshall Plan to rebuild Ukraine. But how should this plan look? Who will administer it? And how can the opportunity be seized not only to restore the status quo ante, but leapfrog toward a modern and innovative Ukrainian economy? So to discuss this, we have a brilliant panel of speakers who I'll introduce. Joining us online, we have Taras Kachka, the Deputy Minister of the Economy of Ukraine. We have Wilhelm Molterer, the Chairman of the GLOBSEC Board of Directors. Arup Banerji, Regional Country Director for Eastern Europe at the World Bank. Magno, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Europe and Eurasia at USAID, and Markus, Berndt, Deputy Managing Director at EIB Global, European Investment Bank. So welcome now to all of our speakers, and thank you for joining us. We'll start with a scene setter. So there's an ongoing study being done from the Kiev School of Economics, and they've calculated that every week Ukraine suffers about $4.5 billion of damage to civilian infrastructure. And the country's total economic losses could rise to around $600 billion. Now, as President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said recently, this isn't just statistics. This is Mariupol, this is Volnovakha, this is Cherniv, this is Borodyanka, dozens and dozens of our cities, towns, and villages. It's impossible to put a number on the cost of reconstruction as long as there remains uncertainty about the duration of the war and how much territory will be controlled by Ukraine's legitimate government. However, Taras, as a scene setter, can you give us an idea of the scope of the rebuilding and restoration of Ukraine?
Good morning. So thank you for your setting the scene. And I think that the starting point, as in your introduction, is the same. So the figures that are collected, consolidated, and verified by Kiev School of Economics and this project on assessing the damages. And this is like a consensus assessment, so shared also by government. And it's not only the figures that are actually awful, but also the reason why they appear, because the way how Russia behaves in this war is just to destroy everything, so that they are not just like behave like classical army, that this army against army conflict, but this is just destruction of everything they see on their way. So housings, plants, factories, stealing grain and steel and everything else. So it's just like total destruction. So that's why our appeal for reconstruction is just really like a military part of our appeal for victory and counteraction against Russia. So indeed, the volume of losses is big in terms of actual cost. So it's like hundreds of billions of dollars, but also an economic impact, because as just an example, so that one of shoulder of our economy was, and I hope in future will be steel sector, but the heart of our steel industry, Mariupol, is totally destroyed, and it's immediately cut several percent of our GDP as such, because the volume says several million tons of steel we used to produce and export from Mariupol are now cut from in complex. So it's not only the cost of the steel, but the facilities there. But this is a chance for us to reconstruct in a way that is closer to the global vision of the future. So if we will take steel as an example, we actually before the war discussed the climate modernization of steel industry. So that's why we believe that here we can combine in our recovery, we can combine both the restoration of economy and also like presentation of the, let's say, global vision of the brighter future for the world. And that's why I believe we deserve solidarity with our partners, with the world, that it's not only an appeal for helping to Ukraine that suffers from the aggression, but also help for the help in actually showing and promoting a global vision of sustainable development, climate-friendly development, and development that will bring brighter future for us and next generations. So that's why our appeal here is not only about figures and scales, but also how we can combine all efforts that we explored before 24th of February, and now all these efforts are becoming even more important for all of us, because what we are looking for is not just simply reparation what was broken, but to actually create a plan, if we are talking about Marshall Plan, that will bring us to converge us more with our allies, with the European Union and the G7 states economies, and also help us to jump and to leap into the future that we jointly promote in our efforts against Russia today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Deputy Minister, for that scene setter. I just wanted to remind the audience, we do encourage audience participation, so please do submit your questions, if you have any, via the GLOBSEC app or the old-fashioned way, raise your hand. I'd like to talk a little bit more about this Marshall Plan concept, right? Because the original Marshall Plan funds were more than 90% grants and less than 10% loans. So what sort of shape should or can rebuilding assistance to Ukraine take? You know, there's been calls for Western powers to guarantee Ukrainian government bonds, for example, but that would leave Ukraine more heavily indebted. So, Arup, if I can come to you, what options are available and how can multilaterals, DFIs, governments, and the private sector work together?
Thank you, and such a pleasure to be here with this panel. Look, I think, let me talk about two things. First, the Marshall Plan concept, right? You're exactly right that the Marshall Plan was mostly about grants and a little on loans. And that actually was tremendously important in the short years, the 4 years that the Marshall Plan was actually enacted, to bring forth some of the change for Western Europe at that time. But it's also important to remember, as people like Barry Eichengreen has reminded us, that the most important part of the Marshall Plan was actually the transfer of technology. What the Marshall Plan did was really form a strong partnership between the US at that time and Western Europe that brought technology, very much as Taras, you've talked about, right? Bring the technology, bring the ideas, bring the modern ways of doing business, bring the efficiency to Western Europe to enable it to grow on its own. So a huge part, and I'll talk a bit about the mix of foreign assistance, but a huge part of what I think the global community needs to help Ukraine with is the vision that Taras talked about, to help build Ukraine's own self-sufficiency, to help Ukraine have the resources, the revenues that can actually help it grow and restore itself to an economic powerhouse. Now, what about the loans versus grants storyline that you asked about? You're absolutely right that for Ukraine, especially given the devastation that it has gone through economically, not just in terms of infrastructure, repaying high-cost loans over the short term is going to be tremendously difficult. And it would be a crippling burden, because that would actually make the budget use its scarce resources for repaying loans rather than for the services that it provides. So part of the solution is, and we have laid this out in some of our work, is to think through a gradation of resources. First and most importantly, grants. I think grants are what the global community in the short run needs to provide. Lisa, you'll talk about this a bit, and I really want to applaud the US, who has really stepped forward in providing $7.5 billion in grants, pure grants for economic assistance in the short term. But grants are difficult for many countries right now, given the economic situation of the world today. So the next tier really has to be loans, but loans that are concessional, highly concessional to the market, right? And that's where organizations like ours and Markus's comes in, because essentially these are not loans on market terms. Market terms for Ukraine right now are impossibly high, but they are concessional to market, under 2% a year, and very importantly, with a substantial grace period before Ukraine will have to repay it again. And let me make my third and final point. To the extent that the global community has grants that are not large enough, like the US contribution, a huge value proposition for those grants would be to actually buy back the terms of even the concessional loans, especially by having a longer grace period, 10 years, say, before Ukraine has to restart it. And then, with the economic growth that we hope that Ukraine will see, Ukraine will be in a position to pay back by itself without putting a huge burden.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll let Markus please add into that.
Yeah, sorry, I very much agree to what Arup said. I think there's different tiers. I think one other aspect I would like to bring to this is that on top of grants and loans, I think of institutions like ours or the EBRD or others, I think there's also a crucial role to bring in the private sector investors in this. And that brings us then also to the accession process of Ukraine, or I don't know, the association of Ukraine to the European Union, because I think that is then related to what you said at the beginning, the technology transfer, but also the transfer of real financial resources of the private sector. And there's, I think, a role that we can also play as promotional banks to facilitate this, to structure this, to provide the confidence and to catalyze these funds into Ukraine.
Absolutely, thank you. Markus, I'd like to stay with you
Okay.
for a second, because the EIB has increased its investment in Ukraine following the Russian occupation of Crimea in 2014. And, it knows the country well. And speaking in April, the EIB president, Werner Hoyer, said that Ukraine hasn't always been an easy partner. And even prior to the war, governance considerations were material to Ukraine's credit profile. Effective bureaucracy was a key factor in the success of the original Marshall Plan. So to what extent does this issue remain a barrier, potentially, to international cooperation in the reconstruction?
I think that's a very good question, because it's on everybody's mind. But I think there's two things, and of course, we, like with all partners, you always face some of the challenges that you work with, but we manage to work with many partners around the world. But I think there's two things that changed fundamentally going forward that make me very optimistic on this front. One is, I think the relationship of the Ukrainians with their government has changed dramatically in this war. I think it's sad, the occasion is very sad, but I think there is a different perception of the value of having these institutions, a different perception of being a country. It's not like I try to maximize my gains or I try to minimize the taxes I pay or other things. It's a clear understanding, and that I think has changed for very sad reasons, but it certainly has changed. And the other thing that is very important is this, is trying to link the reconstruction that hopefully we start, to my mind, even earlier than as early as possible, if not now, to link this with the prospect of joining the European Union, which provides a very strong anchor institutionally, which is a kind of a tested model of combining country ownership at the same time as being embedded in an overall institutional framework that allows to address the challenges that every democracy faces in critical situations like this. And I think with these two, I think Ukraine will be an even better partner than it was before the recent aggressions of Russia. So I think that's what makes us optimistic. At the same time, we all know, and our Ukrainian partners are the first to acknowledge that this will be a massive challenge for all of us. And this will be a lot of flows. It's going to be very hard to make sure that the plans are consistent. It's going to be very hard that the little bit that we can give as international community, as much as it is, it will always be too little, given the needs that we just heard about. So we have to be very, very careful to make sure that every euro, every dollar is spent in the most efficient way and is well coordinated. But I think with these two things, a different attitude towards the government and embedding this and having this as an element of the EU process towards joining the EU, I think we have a very good chance to make this a success.
Excellent. I know there's a couple more comments from all the speakers here. I'll start with you, Wilhelm.
Well, first of all, I find it a wonderful sign of hope that we discuss recovery in the midst of the war. Yeah. Because this gives the impression that we are trustful, that we believe in Ukraine, having Ukraine as an independent and free country and as part of the European family. And Taras, I can just make a big applause or compliment what you are doing in this country. It's so impressive. You're putting a mirror in front of us and showing also us what we have to do. I find this extremely, extremely important. Second, talking about Marshall Plan, I'm coming from Austria. Austria, after the Second World War, was the country that was the most endangered by suffering and hunger and starving population. Marshall Plan was the key for making this Austrian story of success. And you will be surprised, Marshall Plan is still in place. We do have in Austria this European Recovery Program, ERP, that's still working. And I give you just a flavor what I think, and I would be very much interested also to discuss this, what is necessary to make it a story of success. And here we have to be crystal clear. First and foremost, we need a proper public structure and the public services in place. And here the link to the accession process is key. Second, don't underestimate, we need a clear list of priorities, what has to be done. And this is the most challenging thing for a Ukrainian government, a clear list of priorities. Because everything is necessary immediately, but we can't do everything at the same time. We need a clear list of priorities. Third, from the very beginning, please let us involve the private sector. It is not possible to do everything just by public money or grants. We need the private sector engaged in this, let's say, list of priorities. And fourth, let's not talk about either or. We should not talk about either grant or loans or either public or private. We need everything. Yeah. And the blending of the capacity of the public sector and the capacity of the private sector is key. And for that, these promotional institutions play a critical role. And one of the ideas could be that the Ukrainians are also creating a promotional bank to have the proper partnership in that. And last but not least, I think we should listen carefully what Ukrainians need. You have mentioned Tara steel sector. I think we should take into account agriculture. That's key for the country. We should take into account from the very beginning, not infrastructure just, but also SMEs, for instance, in Ukraine. And we should make also an approach that covers Ukraine as a country and not just, let's say, some areas. Because the question of equal distribution of aid and help is key to have the proper support of the Ukrainian people. These are just a few things, and I can just tell you, let's do it. Yep. Full stop. Let's start it as soon as possible. And this is practically now.
Thank you. Lisa, to you, and then Arup, and then we'll go back to Taras to hear from him.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I mean, I'd like to, instead of maybe Marshall Plan for Ukraine, I feel more comfortable talking about it as the Ukraine plan, because as you know, the other panelists have noted, and as the Deputy Minister have noted, it has to be Ukraine-led. Yeah. The Ukraine people and the government of Ukraine need to identify the priorities among the priorities, because the challenges are huge, the needs are huge. For USAID, we are used to operating in multiple timelines. So on February 24, first day of the invasion, USAID immediately sent a disaster assistance response team on that very day. In the medium term, we're trying to assist small businesses, farmers to be able to maintain and continue their livelihoods, trying to assist the millions of internally displaced people who need some economic assistance as well as cash assistance. But in the long term, which is probably the hardest of all, is we need to keep our focus on what is the big goal, which is to ensure that Ukraine in the long term, as the Deputy Minister mentioned, has sustainable development. And that means supporting democratic governance and a market economy in Ukraine. And that is where we have, even through the invasion, we've continued our programs in Ukraine. We have about 700 staff of our implementing partners and 40 programs ongoing, because the reforms have to continue. And I have to say, Ukraine has actually made a lot of progress. We talked about accountability and transparency. We supported the government in developing an e-procurement system, Prozoro, and we also supported Dozoro, which is a civil society watchdog. And I think whether it's loans, grants, I mean, as that assistance comes in, it's very critical for accountability to come through, and it gives confidence not just in the international community, but more importantly to the people of Ukraine, that the money coming in is spent in direct benefit to the people of Ukraine. And the last point I'll make is on the private sector, which Mark, Arup, and Wilhelm had said. You cannot attract private investment if rule of law, if the business policy environment are conducive to investment. So the long-term reforms are needed, and I know Ukraine is not waiting, and neither is USAID.
Thank you. Arup.
Let me be brief in the interest of conversation, but I really want to pull some of the points that were made together in terms of the private sector. And I think exactly as you said, that we need to quickly have private money flowing in. And a big part of that, therefore, going to the list of priorities, has to be the set of conditions that essentially de-risk the private sector. Some of that can be played by partners, right? The de-risking part, it can be insurance and others, but a big part of that is confidence in the rule of law, in corporate governance of the large state-owned enterprises that still dominate Ukraine, including in the financial sector. And I think that has to be a big part of the story of reconstruction that the Ukrainian government puts forward for the world. Because eventually, the longest term impact, as all the panelists have said, for Ukraine is a thriving private sector, Ukrainian private sector, but with foreign, European, American, global firms coming in and playing an important role in reviving the economy, providing jobs, alleviating poverty.
Absolutely, thank you. Taras, over to you.
Thank you. I just make a lot of remarks, but I think that we have a rather consolidated view and comprehensive view. So that first of all, I would like to highlight that actually the nature of our discussion about economic recovery is also a part of big solidarity. So it's not like our bill for please pay for the damages made by Russia. So for me, it's wrong, because this is a case for reparations. So that Russia should pay for the damages it is doing, and I hope that we will be at that moment when Russia will do reparations, because we all believe that Russia will lose this war. But this issue of recovery is a matter of solidarity, is a matter of, let's say, common vision of our goals, of sustainable development goals, whatever framework you will take. So Western values, market economy, or something more like more, let's say, bureaucratic UN sustainable development goals lists. So in all these areas, we actually together. So that's why this is a matter of economic and solidarity. So that's why this is the foundation of this pledge for recovery. So that's why it should be oriented on something more than just covering the damages caused by Russia. Second thing that I would like to highlight is that we already have a resilience of Ukrainian business that actually helps us a lot. So that banking system operates, communication operator, mobile operators works quite well. Ukrainian Railways is doing best in delivering goods into Ukraine, out of Ukraine, etc., etc. So that's why I think that this initial shock of war was actually, we managed to go through it, and now these core elements of Ukrainian economy is operating, and this is a really good sign for everyone. So also for the early investments to come into Ukraine. So with your support, and as well, so that you know that Ukraine has really diversified economy with really strong connections to the private world. When we are talking about agriculture, for example, agriculture is actually a force which is built for many years together with American companies like Cargill or French companies like Soufflé and also Gulf countries like DP World, actually, Dubai port owning some capacities, and Saudi Arabia, Salik owning some land and in Ukraine as well. So that's why the agriculture in Ukraine is a symbol that it's not like state-owned. It's actually something global. So that where a lot of companies invested a lot. So that's why official development partners like European Investment Bank or World Bank, and so it should be like they should be facilitators and help and some kind of like a guarantee for this private inflow to go into Ukraine. So sometimes we had a discussion, so that indeed Ukraine is not the most comfortable partner, especially when we are talking about corporate governance for state-owned enterprises and our constant fights with what we are thinking like a sovereignty or a better solution for better understanding for global world. But in reality, I think that what we are looking for is your support is actually in presenting us for the private world as a really vibrant and diversified economy. And what is really surprising me is that you helped me to understand that actually our bid for EU accession is not like a ultimate goal, but a necessary axiom for the success of this recovery. Because I agree with you, so that Ukrainian institutions, of course, we can be really happy that pandemic experience and communicating in WhatsApp with all my colleagues and deputy minister helped us in these early days of war. But in reality, sustainable institutions is what we need in order also to attract and to actually manage this big idea of economic recovery. Yeah. And in reality, I think just to conclude from what I said at the beginning, the idea of recovery is not just another plan for like development or support, so something we used to develop together with World Bank and USAID and Investment Bank. This is something new. This is a real political pledge to the world that we need something more, and not only in terms of scale, so billions, not only in terms of the cost, because the question of grants and loans is just a mere question of cost of these finances, but something like big intellectual investment into making this, let's say, final step for converging Ukraine with Western world finally completely, like this war actually detach us from Russia completely with no nuances or no discussions, because it's just simply they are enemies and we are fighting against them, but you are friends and you are our allies. And this economic pledge here is just like a final step for the economic convergence with our partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Taras. I have one question that I'd like to bring up now, because if we were to do a word cloud of a lot of the conversations that we've heard over the past couple of days, it's things like solidarity, collaboration, partnership, which are all, great sounding words, but let's talk about what that means in practice, because, and this has been alluded to, with rising food and gas prices, the possibility of a recession, many Western states are, I assume, focused on combating issues at home than on help for Ukraine. So beyond promises and commitments from Western leaders, how much political will and support from the populations really exist for such an exercise? Wilhelm, I'll start with you.
Well, first of all, we have to fight for that. That's by definition, because solidarity is not a given. By the way, nothing is a given currently. Fighting for solidarity means also fighting the war fatigue. This was a discussion about the last couple of days, and this is our obligation, full stop. I would make, Taras, two comments. The one is, I think we should really consider the strong link between the accession planning and stages and the recovery planning and stages. This is extremely important. And for that, I think a seconding is necessary. And this comes also to what GLOBSEC is planning to do. We are talking about money, and that's obvious that this is necessary, and I think we don't understand in full what's the amount really needed. It's in any case huge. But what Taras said, and I think we should go a bit deeper. Please give us also an indication where you need advice. Because the one thing is to have money, but the other thing is to spend money in the right direction for the right priorities in a proper manner. And I think this is something crucial that we can offer also, not just GLOBSEC, but many others. Besides money, it's also advice and giving, let's say, the right support. And this is for me a key thing. Just to close this means also, again, the connection between the process of accession to the European Union and the recovery planning, because this must be based also on intellectual capacity. And here we need also the clear requests from Ukraine. What do we need and when? One element we have not tackled, and I find this critical and important, we should talk also about social infrastructure, because this is something of urgency for a country post-war. Hospitals, schools, kindergarten, and all these things. And this is necessary also to convince the people in Ukraine.
Absolutely. Arup, over to you.
I really am glad you brought up the last point. And let me build a bit more on that. Eventually, I think too much of the conversation, and I've been part of many, on reconstruction has concentrated on infrastructure, including social infrastructure. But actually, it is about, as Taras, you put it brilliantly, about a vision for Ukraine's future.
Indeed.
And there is a lot to be done, especially in building Ukraine's and maintaining Ukraine's amazing human capital. So what you have in Ukraine, as all of you know, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, is Ukraine a world leader? Yes, in agriculture, but also in technology, right? In the tech industry. Yeah. Ukraine has created as many unicorns as continental Europe over the last 3 years. This is a fact that's not actually well understood. So you have actually in Ukraine a tremendously strong infotech area, which is small, it's contained, and it's not broad. So part of the comparative advantages that Ukraine can build on is actually that. And there we do have a challenge. Ukraine's human capital, if you look at learning losses and gaps, is actually declining because Ukraine does not yet have a modern education sector. So part of the process of accession to Western values, to Western standards, has to be a really strong focus on restoring and even leapfrogging Ukraine's educational and technical capacities broadly across the population of Ukraine. And that will make Ukraine a powerhouse that we haven't actually talked about in traditional, apart from the traditional ways that we have talked about things.
Absolutely. I'd like to go back onto that political will side of things from the American, from the US perspective as well. So Lisa, from your perspective, how much support do you feel there is from the US public?
I think it's very clear from the U.S. government, level, the support and the assistance, whether it's development, humanitarian, or military assistance. That's very clear. One of the things we also encountered, and even in the early days of the war, is just the amount of corporate interest as well in supporting Ukraine. And then in even small communities in the United States, you see a lot of just voluntary efforts to help communities. We have all seen, the atrocious, implications of the war on TV. And for the United States, as a me as a public official, but also in private, Ukraine is fighting for the soul of its country.
Yeah.
And there's nothing probably more dear to each and every one of us than the values we hold, on liberty and freedom and respecting the territorial integrity of a sovereign country.
Yeah.
So I think many of our friends in Ukraine have said they are fighting for the values that we hold dear. And this resonates not just with somebody working in government, but, even with, our populations in communities, in rural areas in the United States. And I think that's why, if I may, with my European friends, it's also why Europe has come together in such a way that, probably not seen in the last few years. And we're very much working with the European Union. We're constantly coordinating and with the international financial institutions. In fact, Arup and I will have a lot to talk about after this forum.
Excellent. Markus, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to come back to your original question. Is there enough support given the domestic challenges?
Yeah.
I think it is recognized that there is no trade-off. These domestic challenges are very much linked towards what's going on in Ukraine, and have, I think, once again reminded us of the interlinkages that we have on this continent and the importance of addressing them together, including very tough situations that we have in the east of Europe, in Ukraine. And therefore, I don't think there is a fatigue. There will be a developing fatigue and saying, now I have to deal with the fuel or food in Europe. I don't. Maybe I'm biased because I'm working for the EU, but I'm very, very optimistic that the Europeans have realized how important Ukraine is for us, not only the EU is for Ukraine, and how important it is that we address this together. And to what Tara said, it is indeed impressive how resilient and vibrant the Ukrainian private sector and government and everybody was pushing forward. And I think what is important now is that we don't hesitate in supporting this. I think infrastructure is needed now to help this momentum. We have to be able to support now Ukraine in enabling accessing markets to get the wheat out of the country and to build on this vibrant economy. And we have to, I think, now signal to the private sector that there is a strong anchor that they can count on in terms of rule of law and everything that's required by starting now a process that brings Ukraine into the EU. I think we say this is our central scenario, and we say Ukraine must win, right? And we know that's true. So let's act under this scenario and start all this support now and not wait for what we know will have to happen. Because the longer we wait, the more damage is done to the Ukrainian economy. And we have to, we don't have the luxury to wait. We are interlinked. We are one economic, one value space in Europe, in the West, with our partners and everybody. So I think that is what is important. I don't think there is a trade-off. And if people think there's a trade-off, we have to do a better job to explain there is no trade-off between the domestic challenges that we face and the situation that we have. And there's no reason to wait for anything. We have to rebuild Kiev now, and we have to rebuild all the places where we can now. And yes, there will always be the risk that something will be destroyed again. But that will also be the same in 5 years or 10 years. So we have to build up the resilience now and allow Ukraine to be an even more vibrant country, and allow the private sector to realize that we're serious in order to then invest in the future of Ukraine and in the future of Europe.
Exactly. Thank you very much. There's quite a few questions coming in, so I'd like to just pause and take some questions from the audience. First of all, we've got one from a gentleman, Kurt Volker, in the audience, so please do, let's get a microphone over to you. And if you'd like to stand up and ask your question.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to hear all of the comments and all of the agreement here. I think you've brought out a lot of critical points, and if I could just join in saying, start now is absolutely right, that Ukraine needs economic growth in order to shorten the war and to successfully win the war. So we shouldn't be waiting for some mythical thing to happen that we have to do now. There are two military things that are important that relating to this. One of them is demining, where that needs to be part of our assistance for agriculture, for oil and gas exploration. Demining is critical. And second is opening the port of Odessa. And this is something that I don't think any of us, United States or NATO allies, are focused enough on. It is not just about the immediate grain crisis. This is about Ukraine's recovery. And it is, to me, incomprehensible that we are not standing up for freedom of navigation in international waters in the Black Sea. Third thing that was mentioned is restarting the economy. Growth is, to me, the critical thing. It's not about aid. It's about growth. And finally, despite all the agreement here that we've heard, which I think is tremendous, I do want to point out that there will be different expectations. I know already in Ukraine, people are saying, give us the money, we know what to do with it, we will deploy it. I know from the US and the European Union, people will say, no, we need transparency, we need accountability, we have our own processes. So my question and recommendation is, are we taking steps now, because we need to be acting now, to create a new mechanism for Ukraine and its priorities and needs to be expressed, for the US, the European Union, the international financial institutions to be listening to this, coordinating activity, and making decisions on programs and implementation? Because I think unlike the original Marshall Plan, this is not going to be one thing. Yeah. I think it's going to be a multitude of mechanisms and efforts executed severally by all of the different people doing it, but it does need to have this sense of Ukrainian priorities and coordinated implementation by an international community. So is this moving?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kurt. Taras, I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond to that.
Oh, yes, so I have a lot to respond. So first of all, I think that in terms of current needs, so that's all what we discuss here. So everything is connected, because after all the domestic concerns of every individual household, of course, every private person wants cheap fuel, like it's like a core basic of politics in Hungary. So that's price of diesel is like a key for winning elections. But in reality, if we think about inflation, so inflation in Western world is caused by Russia. So first of all, the blackmail by gas, now this food crisis. If half of the percentage points of inflation is a food inflation, this is food inflation caused by food crisis and by blockage of seaports. And by the way, it's actually, I agree with Kurt that we need to unblock Odessa port, but please be aware that there are 3 ports nearby Odessa, so Chernomorsk, Pivden, and Odessa, and Mykolaiv as well. And only all 4 of these ports can actually satisfy the demand for our wheat. So in any case, even partial unblockage of seaports will require further investments into logistics on western border, land border to the EU, and export of grain to the EU. But so, and if I cannot even want to imagine, but if Ukraine and Western world will fall in this war, it will bring to investments in Western world very gloomy moods, and it will bring more economic problems to the Western world because of this global geo-economic competition, etc. So that's why this solidarity in economy and in combining with military solidarity is important for resolving domestic problems. And it's going from the very high strategic request for this Marshall Plan into something which is even more important, like unblocking seaports and resolving food crisis. It is important for Egypt and for Germany in equal terms, but for Egypt it is a matter of hunger. For Germany it's a matter of inflation, which worries all people in Germany. But the problem is there in Black Sea, and now how Russia present this is that they will give us a grace of freedom of passage in our waters. So just it's not normal. So it should be otherwise. So we need to highlight that it's actually their guilt that there is a food crisis. But you know that this 1 hour session is not enough for even to list the set of problems, because it's really too comprehensive. So that's why we need to think and to complete this list and how different instruments coexist and cooperate with each other now, because the initial shock of aggression actually passed. Our economy shows some resilience, but it will not survive without your help, your immediate help, in terms of public finance support, in terms of encouragement for investments, because the next 3-6 months will be decisive, just not to go into, let's say, long-term collapse of Ukrainian economy. But we need to be aware that when we are talking about Marshall Plan, usually we are talking about a very big set of different instruments. So like EU accession is also part of these instruments because it's about institutions. So of course, when we are talking about unblocking seaports, is just that this is also part of this Marshall Plan, just to give our agriculture possibility to operate and feed the world. But this is more market driven. So we need to unblock problems for private market to continue to operate. And then if we will structure all these demands, what we are generally called by umbrella of Marshall Plan, we will go closer to the projects of recovery of social infrastructure. So infrastructure and social infrastructure, something closer to the mandate of your institutions. So that's why what is needed from Ukrainian government is just this clear vision, how we actually make all these elements of puzzle into one picture, that our pledge for EU accession is actually our offer and promise that we are going to complete construction of proper institutions and proper governance to attract investments. Our pledge to unblock seaports is actually a pledge for to give an opportunity for market forces to feed the world, because we have the resilient business that actually can feed the world and resolve these problems. And our appeal to the institutions with finances for recovery is just to complement all these all other pledges and all other requests. So this is something what is needed from Ukrainian government. I hope that the next big event in Lugano will help to do this. We will have an opportunity to spend several sessions and more people than just 5 of us to talk about it. So, but this is really what is needed now, because we cannot simply reduce the complex request from Ukraine to the world into simple formula. We need a Marshall Plan with $1 trillion of US dollars. So in reality, we need very complex effort, very intellectually demanding effort of combining different processes. And we cannot just simply reduce it into one project management unit which will do everything. EU accession, investment attraction, unblocking seaports, the mining, etc. So this is really huge effort, and I am really glad that we are trying to make these connections in these discussions, and I think that we will manage to develop it. But indeed, the results should be visible already now for coming weeks, so we have really no time for longer planning or longer project management. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, we have about 10 minutes left. There's a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to take a couple, but please do keep them brief. The lady at the back first, who has had her hand up for some time, and then I will come to you. So if you can stand up and introduce yourself.
I'm going to give the mic to my Ukrainian colleague.
Please.
Thank you, Melinda. Taras and colleagues, my name is Paulo. I'm the fellow at GLOBSEC now, but I used to be the economy minister in 2014. Taras, it's less of a question, more a short remark. I want to compliment the current team at the Ministry of Economy for pushing the reform, actually, despite the war. And what you're doing in trade and what your colleague Igor Dedura is doing, pushing the new labor code, what the minister is doing, correcting the mistake with now basically deregulating the gas market, I mean the gasoline market, exactly, and many other things that you're doing. That's what's needed, and this is a precondition to facilitate innovation and entrepreneurship and small business and competition in Ukraine, and all of these things are needed. So please keep going, and thank you very much, and back to you, Melinda.
Thank you. Question from this lady here, please.
Thank you very much. Evelina Chakarova, Director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy based in Vienna. I would like to start also with a very short comment to bring in some optimism amid this precarious situation. In my view, I mean, having observed Ukraine's development and progress when it comes to association agreement, when it comes to participation in this partnership, Ukraine will not start from the scratch. There is a document that is more than 1,000 pages already that Ukraine has signed in 2016 and has been implementing, and all of these areas that you've actually mentioned, there has been so much progress in that. So that's the first optimistic comment. Second one, what I've observed this time, because Ukraine has been already twice invaded in 2014, right, in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. And it was not because of NATO expansion, it was because of European Union membership. So it's also very important for the narrative. The second optimistic note I have is that what I've observed is crowdsourcing, crowdfunding. A lot of successful stories coming out from Ukraine where people were reaching out to the international community in a private manner. And they were successful in gathering means, but also in the European member states, where people collected money for military assistance. So we should also not ignore this. My question, very short one, regarding reparations from Russia. We had this really new moment in the Western sanctions that is freezing reserve assets by Russia. Do you think that this kind of, I think, 250 billion that are now frozen can be considered for the reconstruction, even now amid the war? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. I'm going to give our panelists 2 minutes to answer that. I think, Markus, perhaps from you.
Well, I think, well, first of all, it's beyond my, I'm not working for the Commission. I think we have to be, indeed, maybe the answer is, first of all, I think Russia has to be held accountable. And there have, as was said, there have to be reparations being paid. And second, we have to be creative in finding the resources to stem the paramount task ahead of us. Yeah. Now, what is the right or wrong way? How do we preserve the rule of law within the European Union that we just talked about to generate confidence of private investments, and how this will be done is a question that's beyond me, but I think it's certainly something we shouldn't dismiss like this, but seriously look into.
Absolutely.
Well, this issue is on the table, no doubt about, but I would not rely on that, because if you want to start now, don't wait before the solution on that is there, because to be quite frank, this is an issue where a lot of lawyers will earn a lot of money. So therefore, don't rely on that. Keep it on the table, but don't rely on that. Second comment, I think the global dimension is key, Kurt. And we should also think about what this means in the long-term perspective. For instance, the question of what role the Black Sea will play. Yeah. How do we make the linkage via Black Sea, Caspian Sea, towards Central Asia, for instance, because all these will be look totally different. Maybe we don't understand in full how it really look like. Third, it's a comprehensive thing. Taras is absolute right. If you have something comprehensive, you have to start on a certain point of time, because otherwise you wait until the picture is totally clear. And last but not least, one idea could be also to have this, let's say, war fatigue concept or fight it. Yep. It sounds a bit primitive, but if you have a partnership from a city X in the European Union with a city in Ukraine, if you have a partnership on a municipalities level with a region in Ukraine, then you get ownership of our European people in the long-term perspective, because what we should take into account, it's not an issue of months, it's an issue of years, what we are talking about. And we have to keep this level of solidarity alive for long. Yep. Therefore, this regional partnership concept, also to integrate the civil society in this concept, is for me a very, very important thing. I was in touch with the Association of Austrian Mayors, and I know they stand ready to do, and I love it, because then you have really this long-term solidarity, also taking civil society on board.
Thank you very much. Now, it's almost all we've got time for. It's been a very, very engaging session with loads of participation from the audience. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to you all. I'd like to give the last word to Taras. Now, the stakes here are very high. Rebuilding a free, European, democratic and successful Ukraine, as we've heard, will require a concerted effort and, let's be honest, hard grind. What are the risks, Taras, of getting this wrong? And what lessons can be taken from the past to ensure that this opportunity is not lost?
I think that first of all, I agree, so that we had a set of questions here and remarks about the experience and fatigue. And I think that in reality, this our experience after 2014, after the initial invasion of Russian Federation, our experience with our EU accession dreams and implementation of association agreement, and our experience in cooperation with all international institutions. So the word fatigue is used quite commonly, but in reality, this is an experience on which we can base trust. So like here today with the European Union, so that suddenly we discovered that we can easily resolve our issues on the border by recognizing that our rules actually based on EU rules in different areas, in phytosanitary, veterinary, customs, etc., etc., it can be done easily. So in these fatigues, we have a lot of experience that can be used for the future. Yeah. But what we need is actually to have this, let's say, giant leap of solidarity and trust to Ukraine and from Ukraine to the world in terms of getting something bigger, in terms of, as I said, intellectual scale, so intellectual engagement with Ukraine. So it's not only like this time we need more money or this time we need more market access. So this time we need more, let's say, this intellectual solidarity. And I agree that the level of interconnections is not yet visible, and the situation in Black Sea and other dimensions. So there will be a lot of things we will discover when we will talk about this economic recovery for Ukraine, and it will be extremely interesting and provided energy for further economic development of all region. And that's why it might be interesting for the EU as well as for Ukraine. So, and this time, I think that it's time just to collect all this and to move further. So we need to use all even bad lessons we learned into something positive now. So that's why I'm really optimistic about the feasibility of this big intellectual project we used to call Marshall Plan. So there are good, and you see the comments from audience, because everyone has to add something into this picture. So that's why it's not only for someone on the margins to think about this. Now everyone has to add a lot to this. So that's why we, in this particular 100 days of tragedy in Ukrainian territories, we can add the decades of slow integration of Ukraine into Western world in different dimensions: academia, markets, experts, etc., etc. So now we can use all these experience we earned for decades for resolving current big problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Taras. That's a very interesting and important message to end on. Well, that's all we have time for. I'd like to, please do join me in thanking all of our panelists. And thank you, all of you, for joining us. Now, there'll now be a coffee break. Please do come back here at 12:10 for the next session. Thank you.